The icy wind howled through the neighborhood as I stared at my dark house, disbelief turning to anger in my chest. Every other home on Maple Lane glowed with warmth and light, except mine. My breath formed clouds in the January air while I fumbled with frozen fingers to unlock my front door. This wasn't a power outage. This was deliberate. My name is Preston Faulkner, and 3 months ago I moved into Pinecrest Estates, a supposedly upscale community in northern Michigan. What the realtor failed to mention was that the homeowners association here was run like a small dictatorship by a woman named Karren Wilkinson, who took the stereotype of her name to new heights. I pushed open the door to find my house as cold as a meat locker. The thermostat read 38 degrees. I tried the light switch again, nothing. My phone showed 4 missed calls from my sister, who was supposed to be watching my house while I was away on a 3-day business trip. I immediately called her back. "Preston, thank God." "I've been trying to reach you," Wendy's voice came through with obvious relief. "Something's wrong with your house. I came by yesterday to water your plants like you asked, and all the power was off. I thought maybe you forgot to pay the bill." "I have autopay," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "And I just paid the electric bill last week." I moved to the kitchen window and looked across at the HOA president's house directly opposite mine. Karren Wilkinson stood at her window watching my house, her arms crossed over her chest with what looked like satisfaction. "I need to make some calls. I'll get back to you," I told Wendy before hanging up. My first call was to the power company. After navigating their automated system, a service representative confirmed what I suspected. "Mr. Faulkner, our records show your service was disconnected yesterday at 2:17 p.m. at the request of the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association. They have override authority for utilities in your community." "Override authority? That can't be legal," I said, pacing my increasingly frigid living room. "It's in your HOA agreement, sir. Many planned communities have these provisions for emergency situations or code violations." Code violations. That had to be it. Karren had been on my case since I moved in first about the color of my mailbox. Apparently, midnight blue was not the same as the navy blue specified in the regulations. Then about my garbage cans being visible from the street for a whole 2 hours on collection day. And most recently about the wreath on my door that used non-approved seasonal colors. I thanked the representative and ended the call, then immediately dialed the HOA office. No answer. Of course. It was 7:30 p.m. I left a message that probably included more profanity than was strictly necessary. With no power and the temperature continuing to drop, I grabbed some essentials and headed to a nearby hotel. My house was simply too cold to stay in, especially with the forecasted overnight low of 12 degrees. As I backed out of my driveway, I saw Karren step onto her porch, phone in hand, watching me leave. The next morning, I was at the HOA office as soon as it opened at 9:00 a.m. The receptionist, a nervous-looking young man named Tim, visibly winced when I said my name. "Mr. Faulkner, Mrs. Wilkinson is expecting you. Go right in." Karren Wilkinson sat behind a large mahogany desk in an office decorated with framed HOA awards and photos of her standing with various local officials. Her silver blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she wore a turtleneck sweater in a shade of pink that clashed with her perpetually flushed face. "Mr. Faulkner," she said without standing, "I assume you're here about the utilities." "You cut my power," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "In January, in Michigan. It was 12 degrees last night," Karren smiled thinly. "We issued 3 violation notices regarding your holiday decorations." The wreath was still up past the January 5th deadline. Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws clearly states all holiday decorations must be removed within 5 days after the holiday. "So you cut my power because of a wreath?" I could hardly believe what I was hearing. We take our community standards very seriously, Mr. Faulkner. When homeowners refuse to comply with multiple notices, escalating enforcement is necessary. She slid a folder toward me. Here are copies of the notices we sent. The final notice clearly stated utilities would be suspended if compliance wasn't achieved. I flipped through the folder. The first notice was dated December 28th when I was visiting my parents for Christmas. The second was dated January 2nd when I was still away. The third was dated January 5th, the very deadline day. I never received these. I was out of town until January 6th. Karren shrugged. We're not responsible for homeowners who don't arrange for their mail to be collected during absences. Additionally, all notices were emailed. I pulled out my phone and checked my email, including my spam folder. Nothing from the HOA. I never got any emails either. Perhaps you should check the email address you provided upon move-in, Karren said dismissively. Now, once you remove the wreath and pay the $500 non-compliance fee, we'll restore your utilities. $500. For a wreath I didn't even know I was supposed to take down because I never received your notices. Plus an additional $150 administrative fee for the disconnection and reconnection of services, Karren added, her expression unchanging. I felt my temper rising. This is absurd. You can't just cut someone's utilities in the dead of winter without ensuring they've actually received proper notice. I assure you, Mr. Faulkner, everything was done according to our bylaws, which you signed and agreed to upon purchasing your property. She slid another form across the desk. Payment is due before services will be restored. I stared at the form, then at Karren. Turn my power back on today. I'll take down the wreath immediately, but I'm not paying these ridiculous fees for violations I was never properly notified about. Karren's smile never reached her eyes. I'm afraid that's not how this works. No payment, no power, it's quite simple. I left the office seething, headed straight home, and tore the wreath from my front door. The temperature inside had dropped even lower overnight. I checked my phone's weather app. The high today would barely reach 15 degrees. Another night without heat could mean disaster for my pipes. Reluctantly, I drove to the bank, withdrew the cash, and returned to the HOA office. Karren seemed almost disappointed that I'd capitulated so quickly. Power should be restored within 24 hours, she said after processing my payment. 24 hours, it's freezing outside, my pipes could burst. Our utility liaison only processes restoration requests once per day at 5 p.m. You should have thought of that before violating our clearly stated policies. Her smug expression told me she was enjoying this. I spent another night at the hotel, checking my home's smart thermostat app obsessively to see if power had been restored. Finally, around noon the next day, I saw the system come online. I rushed home to find the heat slowly warming the house from its dangerously cold state of 32 degrees. I walked through the house turning on faucets to check the pipes. Everything seemed fine in the kitchen and downstairs bathroom. Then I went upstairs. As soon as I reached the landing, I heard a steady dripping sound coming from the guest bathroom. Water was seeping under the door. When I opened it, I was met with a disaster. The pipe in the exterior wall had frozen and burst. Water was spraying everywhere, soaking through the ceiling below. I frantically searched for the main water shutoff valve, finally locating it in the utility room and twisting it closed. The damage was extensive. The guest bathroom was flooded. Water had seeped through the floor and damaged the ceiling in the dining room below, and the hardwood floors in both rooms were already beginning to warp. I called a plumber and a water damage restoration company, both of whom quoted emergency rates that made my stomach churn. The initial estimate for repairs, $25,000. And that didn't include the plumbing work, which would add another $3,000. I took photos of everything, documenting the damage from every angle. Then I called my insurance company. The agent was sympathetic but concerned. This is a complicated situation, Mr. Faulkner. If the power was shut off due to non-payment, the claim might be denied. But since the HOA cut your power, I'll need to check with our claims department about coverage in this scenario. That evening, as I sat in my cold, partially flooded house waiting for the restoration company to arrive, I saw Karren Wilkinson walking her small white poodle past my house. She slowed as she approached, clearly taking in the restoration van and the plumber's truck in my driveway. I could swear I saw a flicker of satisfaction cross her face before she continued on her way. Something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about overzealous rule enforcement. This felt personal, vindictive. I decided then that I wouldn't just fix my house, I would fight back. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. I requested an emergency hearing, citing the extensive damage to my property. To my surprise, the board agreed to meet the following evening. The meeting was held in the community center, with 5 board members seated at a long table at the front. Karren sat in the center, flanked by 2 older men and 2 middle-aged women who all seemed to hang on her every word. About 20 other homeowners filled the audience chairs, curious about the emergency session. I presented my case methodically, showing photos of the damage, copies of my bank statements proving I had set up auto-pay for utilities, and phone records showing I was out of town when the notices were supposedly delivered. I explained that I never received any email notices and showed my search history in my email account as proof. The HOA cut power to my home in the middle of winter without ensuring I had actually received proper notice, I concluded. This resulted in my pipes freezing and bursting, causing over $25,000 in damage. I believe the association should cover these costs, as the damage was a direct result of the HOA's actions. Karren leaned forward. Mr. Faulkner failed to comply with community standards despite multiple notices. The bylaws clearly state that utilities may be suspended for non-compliance. The damage to his home is unfortunate, but is the result of his own negligence. One of the board members, an older gentleman named Walter Davis, adjusted his glasses. Karren, did you personally verify that Mr. Faulkner received these notices? We don't hand-deliver notices, Walter. They were mailed and emailed according to our standard procedures. Another board member, Margaret Thompson, frowned. But given the extreme weather conditions, was cutting power the appropriate first response? Couldn't we have tried a fine or another method first? Karren's expression hardened. The bylaws don't specify weather considerations. Rules are rules. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. To my surprise, several board members seemed uncomfortable with how the situation had been handled. By the end, they had agreed to review the case and make a decision within a week. As the meeting adjourned, several of my neighbors approached me, expressing their own frustrations with Karren's heavy-handed approach. One of them, a retired lawyer named Patrick Jensen, handed me his card. "You might want to look beyond the HOA for resolution," he said quietly. "What happened to your house could potentially be considered criminal property damage. The HOA had a duty of care, especially in dangerous weather conditions." The next day, I took Patrick's advice and consulted with an attorney who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. After reviewing my documentation, she was blunt in her assessment. "This goes beyond typical HOA overreach, Mr. Faulkner. Cutting utilities in sub-freezing temperatures without verifying receipt of notices shows reckless disregard for your property and safety. Given the timeline and circumstances, we could potentially make a case for criminal sabotage." "Criminal sabotage?" I asked, surprised. "Isn't that a bit extreme?" "Not when you consider the facts. The power was cut at the HOA's request during one of the coldest weeks of the year. You have evidence you weren't properly notified, and most damning, you have testimony from your sister that Karren Wilkinson was watching your house after the power was cut, seemingly monitoring the situation." She leaned forward. "Did you know that in Michigan, intentionally damaging property valued over $20,000 can be charged as a felony?" I left the attorney's office with a plan. First, pursue the civil case against the HOA for damages. Second, file a police report regarding possible criminal property damage. The police took my report seriously, especially after seeing the extensive documentation I'd compiled. Detective Michael Rodriguez was assigned to the case and began interviewing neighbors and HOA board members. The investigation took an interesting turn when Tim, the nervous receptionist from the HOA office, came forward with some surprising information. Mrs. Wilkinson specifically instructed me not to call you about the violations. He told Detective Rodriguez during his interview, which I was allowed to observe. When I pointed out that we usually call homeowners for serious violations in addition to sending written notices, she said, and I quote, "Mr. Faulkner needs to learn how things work around here." She also told me to use an old email address from your application that she knew had a typo in it. This revelation changed everything. What had seemed like excessive rule enforcement now looked like deliberate sabotage. The detective expanded his investigation, obtaining a warrant for the HOA's communication records. What they found was shocking. Text messages between Karren and the utility liaison revealed that she had specifically requested that my power be cut as soon as possible, despite the liaison's concerns about the extreme cold. In one message, Karren wrote, "Maybe a few days without heat will teach him to respect our community standards." A week after my initial complaint to the HOA board, they delivered their decision. They would cover all costs related to the water damage and issue a formal reprimand to Karren Wilkinson for overstepping her authority. However, by that point, the criminal investigation had gathered significant momentum. Karren was called in for questioning by Detective Rodriguez. According to the detective's report, she maintained that she was simply enforcing the rules and denied any malicious intent. However, when confronted with the text messages and Tim's testimony, her story began to unravel. The district attorney's office reviewed the case and decided to charge Karren Wilkinson with criminal property damage and reckless endangerment. The community was shocked. The story made the local news, with headlines like HOA president charged in utility shutoff scandal and winter power cut leads to criminal charges. As the criminal case proceeded, I focused on rebuilding my home. The restoration work was extensive, requiring the complete gutting of the guest bathroom, replacement of the dining room ceiling, and refinishing of the hardwood floors in both rooms. The plumbing repairs alone took 3 days to complete. Throughout this process, I discovered that Karren had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for years. Other neighbors came forward with their own stories of excessive fines and harassment. Walter Davis, the board member who had questioned Karren during my hearing, revealed that she had manipulated board votes and selectively enforced rules against homeowners she disliked. "She's had it out for you since you moved in," Walter told me over coffee one morning. "You bought the house that her daughter wanted. Did you know that?" I hadn't known. Apparently, Karren's daughter, Whitney Zakowski, had made an offer on my house before I did, but the seller had accepted my higher offer. Karren had taken it as a personal affront and had been looking for ways to make me miserable ever since. The criminal trial began 3 months after the incident. I testified about the damage to my home and the circumstances surrounding the power shutoff. Tim testified about Karren's instructions to use an incorrect email address. The utility liaison testified about Karren's insistence on cutting my power despite his concerns about the weather conditions. Karren's defense attorney argued that she was simply enforcing the HOA rules and had no intention of causing damage to my property. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on both charges. At the sentencing hearing, Karren maintained her innocence. "I was just doing my job," she told the judge. "The community has standards that need to be upheld." Judge Elaine Richardson was not sympathetic. "Mrs. Wilkinson, Your job was to maintain community standards, not to wage personal vendettas against homeowners. Your actions showed a reckless disregard for Mr. Faulkner's property and safety. In freezing temperatures, cutting someone's power isn't just vindictive, it's dangerous. Karren was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my home. Additionally, she was barred from serving on the board of any HOA for 5 years. The aftermath transformed our community. The HOA board was completely restructured, with Walter Davis stepping up as the new president. New bylaws were drafted with input from all homeowners, including explicit limitations on utility shutoffs and a requirement for confirmed receipt of violation notices before any penalties could be imposed. As spring arrived, I finally finished the repairs on my house. The new bathroom was better than the original, and the refinished hardwood floors gleamed in the sunlight that streamed through my windows. I planted a garden in my backyard with plants that were all HOA approved, of course. Karren Wilkinson sold her house and moved away soon after her sentencing, unable to face her neighbors after the scandal. Her daughter, Whitney, made a point of stopping by my house before they left. "I want to apologize for my mother's behavior," she said, looking genuinely embarrassed. "What she did was inexcusable. I never should have complained to her about losing the bid on this house." "It's not your fault," I told her. "Your mother made her own choices." A year after the incident, our community had transformed. The rigid, fear-based atmosphere had given way to a more collaborative environment. Neighbors helped each other with yard work and home improvements. The community center hosted regular social events that people actually wanted to attend. I was sitting on my front porch enjoying a warm summer evening when Patrick Jensen, the retired lawyer who had first suggested I pursue criminal charges, stopped by with a bottle of wine. "Celebrating the anniversary of the revolution," he said with a grin, settling into the chair beside me. "Has it been a year already?" I asked, accepting a glass. "1 year since Karren's conviction changed everything around here." He raised his glass in a toast. "To the man who stood up to the HOA tyrant and won." I laughed and clinked glasses with him. "I never wanted to be a revolutionary. I just wanted to keep my pipes from freezing." Sometimes that's how revolutions start, not with grand ideals, but with practical concerns. Patrick took a sip of his wine. "You know, in my 30 years of practicing law, I saw a lot of HOA disputes. They're usually petty things: fence heights, unapproved paint colors, holiday decorations left up too long. But what Karren did crossed the line from annoying to criminal. Do you think she ever understood that?" I asked, watching as neighbors walked their dogs along the street, waving to each other and stopping to chat. "Some people never see beyond their own righteousness," Patrick mused. "But the rest of us learned a valuable lesson. Power, both literal and figurative, comes with responsibility." Later that week, the HOA held its annual meeting. Attendance was nearly 100%, a stark contrast to the sparse turnouts of the Karren Wilkinson era. Walter Davis presented the year's financial report, which showed a healthy reserve fund despite the settlement paid to me for damages. "And finally," Walter said, approaching the end of the meeting, "I'm pleased to announce that Pinecrest Estates has been selected as a case study for the National HOA Management Association's report on governance reform. They were particularly impressed with our new communication protocols and emergency response guidelines." There was a round of applause, and I couldn't help but feel a certain pride. My personal disaster had ultimately led to positive change for the entire community. After the meeting, several neighbors invited me to join them for dinner at the local Italian restaurant. As we walked there together, one of them, Susan Henderson, nudged my arm. "You know, when you first moved in, Karren told everyone you were going to be trouble," she said with a laugh. I guess she was right, just not in the way she meant. "Sometimes trouble is exactly what's needed," I replied. 2 years after the incident, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Karren Wilkinson, postmarked from Florida, where she'd apparently relocated. "Mr. Faulkner," it began, "I have completed my probation and community service, and my therapist suggests that making amends is an important part of moving forward. I want to acknowledge the harm my actions caused you and apologize for my behavior. What I did was wrong and no explanation can justify it. I let personal feelings cloud my judgment and abused the authority entrusted to me. I am truly sorry." I read the letter several times, unsure how to feel about it. On one hand, it seemed sincere. On the other, it had taken her 2 years and therapeutic intervention to reach this point. I decided to accept the apology for what it was, a step toward healing for her, and perhaps for me as well. I wrote a brief response thanking her for the apology and wishing her well in Florida. I didn't mention that I was now on the HOA board myself, working to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to another homeowner in our community. Our HOA had become something of a model for others in the region. We'd implemented a comprehensive communication system that required confirmation of receipt for all violation notices. We'd created an appeals process that gave homeowners a fair hearing before any penalties could be imposed. Most importantly, we'd established strict guidelines about utility shutoffs, prohibiting them entirely during extreme weather conditions regardless of violations. The story of my burst pipes and Karren's criminal charges had spread through HOA circles across the state, serving as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power. I'd even been invited to speak at a conference for HOA board members, sharing my experience and the lessons our community had learned from it. My house, once the site of such extensive damage, had become my haven. The repairs had given me the opportunity to make some updates I'd been contemplating anyway. The new bathroom was more modern and efficient. The refinished hardwood floors had a richer, deeper tone than before. Even the dining room ceiling, which had to be completely replaced, now featured recessed lighting that I'd always wanted. Sometimes I thought about how different things might have been if I'd just taken down that wreath before leaving for my business trip. One small action or inaction had set in motion a chain of events that transformed an entire community. It was a reminder of how interconnected our lives are, especially in shared spaces like Pinecrest Estates. 3 years after the incident, I was hosting a neighborhood barbecue in my backyard. Children played on the swing set I'd installed, after getting proper HOA approval, of course, while adults chatted around tables set up on the patio. Walter Davis, still serving as HOA president, raised a glass. "To Preston," he said, "who showed us all that standing up for what's right can change things for the better, even when it starts with something as simple as a holiday wreath." Everyone laughed and raised their glasses. Tim, who had left the HOA office to pursue a degree in community management, added, "And to power both the kind that runs through our homes and the kind that runs our community being used responsibly." As dusk fell and my neighbors gradually headed home, Patrick Jensen stayed behind to help me clean up. He'd become a good friend over the years, often stopping by for coffee or to discuss the latest community developments. "You know, Preston," he said as we folded up the last of the tables, "what happened to you was terrible, but look at what came from it. A more democratic HOA, neighbors who actually know and care about each other. Clear rules that are fairly enforced." He gestured around at the peaceful neighborhood, now softly lit by street lamps. "Sometimes good things come from the worst situations." I nodded, thinking of the long journey from that freezing January night to this warm summer evening. "I never would have chosen to go through it," I admitted. "But I'm grateful for where we ended up." As Patrick left, I sat alone on my porch for a while, enjoying the quiet. In the house across from mine, where Karren Wilkinson had once stood watching my dark house with satisfaction, a young family now lived. Their children had been playing with the others at my barbecue. Their lights glowed warmly in the evening, just like mine. I thought about power, not just the electricity that ran through our homes, but the power we hold over each other in communities like ours. Karren had abused her power, using it to pursue a personal vendetta at the expense of my property and safety. But in the aftermath, our community had reclaimed that power and redistributed it more fairly among all homeowners. The $25,000 in damages to my home had been a high price to pay. The burst pipes, the flooded bathroom, the damaged ceiling and floors, all of it had been devastating at the time. But the true cost of Karren's actions had been paid by her. Her reputation, her position, her place in the community, and ultimately her home. As for me, I had not only rebuilt my house, but had helped rebuild my community. The sabotage that had been meant to drive me away had instead rooted me more firmly in Pinecrest Estates. I had turned a disaster into an opportunity for change, and in doing so, had found my place in a neighborhood that now felt truly like home. I finished my drink and went inside, closing the door on a house that was warm, safe, and filled with memories both painful and precious. The power was on, the pipes were intact, and all was well in Pinecrest Estates, at least until the next HOA meeting.